Perhaps it is fitting that the Christian canon concludes with the book of Revelation, one of the most difficult biblical books to interpret. Christians familiar with the Old Testament would have some orientation to the wide range of motifs and images through the echoes of Israel's story embedded in Revelation. Christians familiar with the New Testament have learned from less obscure text about Jesus and early Christians in community and can bring to their reading of Revelation this foundational information. Still, there's much that can confound hearers and readers of Revelation. Why does Revelation communicate in oblique ways? How is it that Revelation, which reflects numerous biblical traditions, has resulted in strikingly different interpretations, including many that can be unnerving for contemporary readers? When understood from the vantage of apocalyptic literature and its idioms, the book of Revelation becomes much easier to make sense of. We're thinking about apocalyptic scriptures with special attention to the book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse. We begin by considering apocalyptic literature as a distinctive type of writing that also has a particular theological vantage. Then we take up apocalyptic literature that is found in the Hebrew Scriptures, or Old Testament, traditions very important to early Christians. We move to the book of Revelation and how it communicates about the world of its author, John, who is associated with prophecy and with witnessing to Christian communities in Asia Minor. We conclude by noting how the book, reflecting on and addressing John's own historical moment, can provide messages of consolation and hope in troubled times of any era, even while its use of symbolism and evocative language can lead to the book being misread. To begin, what do we mean by apocalyptic literature? The word apocalypse is a Greek term that means an unveiling or a revealing of information. The word occurs in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 1, presenting what follows as the revelation or apokalypsos of Jesus Christ. Forms of this word appear in Greek translations of the Old Testament and in New Testament writings, often in the context of information that God makes known to humans. The semantic basis of the word extends beyond divine communication. That is, the verb can be used in reference to human disclosure. Still, scholars have observed that certain writings from before the Common Era, along with writings produced in the first centuries of the Common Era by Jews as well as by the followers of Jesus, share a common outlook and a similar means of expression, including disclosure of information that would be otherwise unavailable to humankind. Scholars have designated these writings with shared features as apocalyptic. Apocalyptic literature has in common a focus on information from the divine that is revealed, typically by angelic intermediaries. It is the divine prerogative to reveal insights about the nature of the cosmos and scope of human history. Additionally, mysteries related to theodicy, God's justness, and life after death are taken up in these early Jewish and Christian texts. Clearly, people in antiquity had questions comparable to the questions of people today. Challenging times and suffering experienced, despite faithful adherence to tradition, could lead a person to question God's omnipotence. Apocalyptic literature provides, however, a response to cognitive dissonance. Contrary to appearances, God is in control, and in order, although hidden to most, undergirds both space and time. This confidence in the divine is often juxtaposed with claims to earthly power made by political regimes and oppressive forces. Though antagonists appear to threaten God's people, apocalyptic literature presents assurance that God has not forgotten God's own, and that in the appropriate season, God will intervene to end fraught situations, to right wrongs, and to bring restoration. Many biblical texts express confidence in God's justness and order, as well as the gap between human and divine appraisal of situations. Moreover, biblical texts from the Exodus tradition to the prophets address God's acting to correct abusive situations. Apocalyptic texts are certainly related to these traditions, but one difference concerns the scope of the claims made. Amos, an 8th century prophet, directs a warning to the people of Israel during the divided monarchy and shares consequences that will befall the northern kingdom. In contrast, apocalyptic literature of several hundred years later anticipates the decisive end to suffering on a universal scale, encompasses all of human history. Some biblical prophets are focused also on the end of an era or the world as we know it. We refer to knowledge about matters of the latter times as eschatology. For example, Zechariah 14 describes how God will take on Israel's enemies and that on that day there will be dramatically different, even idyllic conditions on earth. Revelations might occur by means of dreams and visions and communicate using symbols, colors, and numbers. Angelic beings who serve as both messengers and interpreters explain the meaning of oblique images and expressions which would otherwise be lost on the worthy human recipient, as well as on the later hearers or readers of the ancient text. Temporally, Jewish writings which share these features seem to emerge in the Second Temple period, and that is sometime following the return of the exile and the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Some of the features may be found in texts from the late 6th and 5th centuries BCE, like Isaiah chapters 56 through 66 or Zechariah chapters 1 through 8, a time when the people formerly of Judah were reestablishing themselves in their community in what became the Persian province of Yehud or Judea. Such text might be considered proto-apocalyptic, that is, a very early form of apocalyptic literature. In eschatological scenarios of proto-apocalyptic literature, God appears as a divine warrior, and there are cosmic upheavals that accompany God's intervention. The majority of texts considered apocalyptic are thought, however, to emerge following the 4th century BCE, especially from a period impacted by Greek rule. Judea and other parts of the Mediterranean world were initially subject to Alexander the Great of Macedon and were influenced by the mixture of cultures which accompanied Alexander's armies. Families who continued Alexander's legacy, Ptolemies in Egypt and Seleucids in Syria, contended also for control of Judea. Texts considered apocalyptic, like the Book of the Watchers, which is found in 1st Enoch, a work referenced in the Epistle of Jude in the sacred scriptures of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, emerged during this time. The Book of the Watchers and comparable apocalyptic writings tend to be associated with seers, visionaries, scribes, and sages. Divinely disclosed secrets about space, time, evil, and post-mortem rewards and punishment are also prevalent in apocalyptic literature, already popular in the 3rd century BCE. A hallmark of this literature is also the prominent role of angels as well as malevolent forces in the cosmos. Information about a pre-established divine timeline and God's definitive conclusion of oppressive forces is especially prevalent in texts from the 2nd century. These include Daniel chapters 7 through 12 and the animal apocalypse, now found in the 4th section of 1st Enoch, which allude to various moments in human history in condensed and focused ways. This apocalyptic literature seems to emerge during the Seleucid rule in Judea and reflects a time when Antiochus IV and his successors were remembered for persecuting those who adhered to Jewish traditions, as described in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Even as apocalyptic literature of this time emphasizes mysteries that are impenetrable without divine guidance, books, writing, and scribal culture come to be reflected in apocalyptic imagery. Apocalyptic traditions continue to be important as early Christianity develops in the Mediterranean world, in which the Roman Empire has supplanted Ptolemaic and Seleucid hegemonic power. Literature of this time is dualistic, with stark contrast between good and evil. Moreover, apocalyptic literature features spiritual battles that rage alongside of human conflicts. An example of these themes may be observed in the War Scroll, which was found in the Dead Sea region, along with other comparable religious texts. The War Scroll links Jewish communities which competed with the author's group and Gentiles with demons and malignant forces. As we move from the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE, supernatural or divine mediators are prevalent in apocalyptic literature. Abstract extensions of the divine, like wisdom, are supplemented with anthropomorphic figures. For example, one like the Son of Man comes to be associated with eschatological judgment. Thus, Second Esdras, which is not canonical but placed in the appendix to the Vulgate, also known as Fourth Ezra chapters 3 through 14, highlights an extraordinary agent of the divine who judges the multitudes. Early followers of Jesus also understood him as fulfilling various senses of Messiah, that is, anointed one, as well as embodying divine mediators like God's creative intellect or logos, as expressed in the Gospel of John, chapter 1. This overview of the emergence of apocalyptic text and features, cued by distinctive moments in Judea, is a simplification of several hundreds of years of history and textual traditions. Not all features appear in equal measure, nor are all the texts and traditions which might be considered apocalyptic surveyed here. There are a plethora of texts associated with revelations or divine disclosures from the start of the Second Temple period to the early 2nd century CE. Many are found within the Bible today and are also in writings of ancient Jews and Christians outside of the Bible. Apocalyptic texts that are not in the Bible can be helpful for readers of the Bible nonetheless, for these can provide additional data about context and literary forms that clarify in turn what the sacred authors meant. We turn now to apocalyptic literature of the Christian Bible. Because apocalyptic literature communicated messages from the divine concerning rewards and punishments, some scholars made a connection between apocalyptic literature and prophetic text in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. Prophetic oracles might include visions, symbolic gestures, and rich imagery, which one finds also in apocalyptic literature. Isaiah and Joel have bold proclamations about the day of the Lord, which in these contexts portend divine reckoning. At the same time, wisdom writings, like in the book of Job, reflect on the mysteries of heaven and earth, exploring the limitations of human knowledge or the necessity of divine disclosure. Wise and righteous individuals who will come to have a special significance in apocalyptic literature appear in biblical books in peripheral ways. These include Enoch in Genesis chapter 5 and Daniel in Ezekiel chapters 14 and 28. While apocalyptic writings could be exploring further those individuals whose biblical stories are tersely expressed, the extent of their later sizable role in text may also hint at their wider significance in the ancient world. An early expression of apocalyptic motifs can be observed in the book of Zechariah, which has sometimes been called a proto-apocalyptic text. Zechariah chapters 1 through 8 depicts the prophet receiving obscure messages from the divine. These messages rely on symbols, colors, and numbers and require angelic intermediaries to explain. For example, in learning about the leadership of the high priest Joshua and the prince Zerubbabel, the prophet sees a vision of a lampstand and 2 olive trees. The image of the trees yielding oil relates well to the prophetic message about 2 anointed agents of God, a high priest and a Davidic prince, both providing leadership to the post-exilic community. Isaiah's vision of God enthroned in the temple, and Ezekiel's vision of the chariot throne and then of a new idealized temple also provide important precursors for later visionaries who understand themselves to be in the divine presence, including in a heavenly context. Further, texts that anticipate a season of restoration look back to the verdant imagery of Eden and anticipate a time when God will defeat even death, as in Isaiah chapters 24 through 27. While apocalyptic elements may derive from earlier Israelite tradition, the most outstanding example of such literature in the Old Testament is the book of Daniel, and in particular, chapters 7 through 12. The book is set during the Babylonian exile, but in fact, chapters 7 through 12 were likely composed in the 2nd century BCE during a time of intense persecution. Antiochus IV, perhaps around 168 or 167 BCE, apparently outlawed Jewish practices and put to death people who continued to follow Torah. Daniel chapters 7 through 12 anticipate a time when the Seleucid reign would be defeated by God and God's elect would rule. The message is communicated through dreams and visions and the use of symbols and animals. Named angels like Gabriel and Michael interpret visions and fight on behalf of God's elect. Human history is divided into discrete periods of time with a preordained end expected. All that occurs, including the suffering of the righteous, is part of the divine plan and coincides with the Seleucid oppression. The book concludes with a description of a blessed afterlife for those who promote justice. Because of its many apocalyptic features, Daniel chapters 7 through 12 is thought to be the most complete apocalyptic work in the Old Testament. The focus on God breaking into human history, an end-of-time judgment of human behavior, the tradition of life after death, and the active role of angels as well as of malevolent spiritual forces like demons or of Satan are part of traditions associated with Jesus and the first Christians as well. The Gospel of Mark presents Jesus proclaiming that the kingdom of God is at hand. The Gospels know traditions of angels as messengers, heralds, and as those who gather the elect in the last days. The four canonical Gospels present Jesus as resurrected and anticipate his future return. Jesus' role as a mediating presence, as a Messiah or Christ, an anointed agent of God, and as a Son of Man, which derives from one like a Son of Man from Daniel 7, an eschatological figure to return on the clouds, also contribute to the apocalyptic nature of early Christian belief. Paul, who had a vision of the risen Christ, anticipated that God would visit the earth someday to judge and then to vanquish even death. Paul also underscored the necessity of belief in the risen Christ. The Catholic epistles reflect a host of apocalyptic themes that range from recalling past moments of judgment to set the stage for anticipated future judgment to the expectation for a new heaven and earth in the time of ultimate restoration. In sum, various books from the New Testament make clear that many early Christians were apocalyptic in orientation, a religious perspective that was received from apocalyptic Jewish tradition. We turn now to the book of Revelation, an extraordinary text that concludes the Christian canon. Revelation's literary form is distinctive. It offers an epistolary framing of an apocalypse. Additionally, the book includes short decrees from the risen Christ to 7 churches of Asia Minor, as well as several hymns, and describes itself as a prophetic message. The book is a fitting capstone to the Christian Bible as it weaves together traditions of the Old and New Testaments. The book of Revelation is attributed to John, an otherwise unknown Christian who conveys that he is on the island of Patmos because of the Word of God and testimony of Jesus. Not much is known about the author. There are thematic and theological affinities among the Gospel of John, letters of John, and the book of Revelation. At the same time, there are significant differences in the grammar and style of Greek of the book of Revelation to challenge the idea that the same person has authored these various texts. Divergent views on the authorship of the book of Revelation were held even among the early church fathers. Moreover, the author of the book seems to view Jesus' 12 apostles, including John of Zebedee, as foundational figures of the past. That is not to preclude the possibility that writings associated with John in the New Testament may emanate from the community associated in some manner with the Apostle John, or given the prevalence of the name. In the New Testament, we read about John the Baptist, John the son of Zebedee, and John Mark. It's possible that John of Revelation is an early Christ follower otherwise unknown to us. For example, Papias of Hierapolis in the 2nd century knew of an elder or presbyter by the name of John. What one may say is that the book of Revelation is strongly grounded in the traditions of ancient Israel and reflects also the idioms of Jewish apocalyptic writings. Scholars have noted the many ways the book of Revelation alludes to traditions familiar from the Hebrew Scriptures, but does so without directly quoting biblical text. The allusions, echoes, and parallels are omnipresent, derive from all sections of the Old Testament, and appear in creative manners not burdened by prior literary context. Numerically significant are references to Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the Psalms, though John does not present these as sources. Revelation mediates ancient Israel through overarching themes like God's concern for God's people recalled in the Exodus narrative, including the plagues. Also familiar from the Hebrew scriptures are the designations for the community of God, priest, or the 12 tribes of Israel, and worship of God through hymns and temple implements and imagery. The commonalities include manifestations of the divine, for example, the heavenly throne room and angelic beings, sacred spaces such as Eden, Mount Zion, and New Jerusalem, and also malevolent entities like the sea, serpent, Satan, and Babylon. There are passing references, for example, to manna and Balaam, that are not explained. Such cursory mentions suggest that the sacred author took for granted that the first audiences of Revelation would also be familiar with traditions associated with ancient Israel. Revelation is thoroughly steeped in the narratives and traditions of ancient Israel, suggesting also that John and communities in Asia Minor had a certain proficiency as well. At the same time, Revelation communicates a message of God's care for God's people and the conclusion to manifestations of evil through expressions and imagery familiar from Jewish and Christian apocalyptic discourse. John conveys the content of auditions and of visions, including of heaven and post-mortem states. John passes along what he receives while in the spirit, that is, while in a mystical state, and John's visions concern spiritual beings like angels who serve as guides, interpreters, and as administrators of God's justice. Angels are also engaged in battle against opposing spiritual forces. Michael and his heavenly helpers fight against Satan and his assistants, who are ultimately ejected from heaven. As is the case with other apocalyptic literature, Revelation uses symbols, colors, and numbers, especially the number 4, which can point to completeness, like the cardinal directions, 7, a number associated with the divine, and 12, recalling the 12 tribes and 12 apostles. The book is elusive, conveying theological messages through vivid images. For example, John has a vision while in the spirit of the risen Christ in Revelation chapter 1. Amid 7 lampstands, one like a son of man appears wearing a robe with a gold sash. The figure's hair is all white, his eyes like a fiery flame, and his feet like polished brass. Later, this otherworldly figure is identified as one who was once dead but now lives forever. In his right hand, he holds 7 stars, and out of his mouth comes a 2-edged sword. The reference to 7 lampstands calls to mind the candelabras or minaret of the Jerusalem temple and signal holiness. White hair, used in Daniel chapter 7 as a fitting description for the Ancient of Days, signals Christ's status in connection to God, underscoring that this vision is not to be understood literally. A 2-edged sword protrudes from Christ's mouth. Elsewhere in the Bible, such a sword refers to the Word of God, associating Christ with potent speech. Another example comes from chapter 5. John is caught up in the Spirit and sees a vision of God with 24 elders and 4 living creatures worshiping the divine. There, John sees a lamb which appears to have been slain with 7 horns and 7 eyes. The details of this vision are again to be understood in a symbolic manner. The lamb that appears slain but is not refers to a theological understanding of Jesus as the Paschal Lamb, whose death recalls the Passover tradition and the sacrificial nature of Jesus' death. The reference to the lamb only appearing to be slain and having 7 horns and eyes makes clear how Christ is alive and is omnipotent, as the horn of an animal signals strength, and omniscient, all-seeing. Revelation also reminds its audience that symbols are to be interpreted. For example, an interpreting angel expounds on the vision of a woman seated atop of a beast with many heads and many horns in Revelation chapter 17. The heads represent hills within a city, and the horns, kings. Revelation is also apocalyptic in that it is disclosing information from the divine that would otherwise be inaccessible. This information refers to both space and time, that the world, contrary to appearances, is firmly under the control of God, and that God's people will be protected through the trials and challenges they face. The communities to whom John communicated were surrounded with reminders of the power of imperial Rome while they celebrated Christ crucified. Not only was the message of these followers of Jesus countercultural, but their experiences of alienation in a polytheistic world pointed them toward another spiritual home and space in which the martyrs and witnesses were sheltered and tended to by God. Revelation provides reassurance of God's majesty, providence, and care, even wiping away every tear of those who face great distress. Rather than simply stating these ideas, the apocalyptic discourse utilized in the book of Revelation demonstrates through vivid and evocative imagery how God intervenes for God's people. Just as apocalyptic rhetoric makes a stark contrast between good and evil, the book of Revelation means to impart a dualistic perspective as well. The path of the faithful witnesses who worship God alone is sharply distinguished from the path of those who collude with imperial Rome and engage in polytheism. The communities in Asia Minor, which would have received the circular letter from John, had to contend with assimilating to practices deplored by Revelation. For that reason, the eschatological rewards and punishments described in Revelation remind its hearers and readers that the stakes are high and that they should not be complacent in how they live and react to the political and cultural forces that surround them. Helpful also to making sense of Revelation is an understanding of how the book reflects the world of John of Patmos. The book of Revelation depicts facets of Greek and Roman culture that made up the visual repertoire of Christians who lived in Asia Minor. The book does so in order to disclose how these should be regarded. For example, the boastful beast of chapter 13, who waged war on the holy ones, is given the number 666. The notion of numbers corresponding to letters in alphabets was common in this ancient context, and in Hebrew, the number 666 could also spell out the name Caesar Nero. In John's own context, Nero was a Roman emperor who was infamous for his persecution of Christians. Within John's use of numbers, in which 7 signals rightness or completion, 6 could also be a way to signal imperfection. Further, the reference to the woman, called a harlot, who is seated upon the beast in Revelation 17, would seem to resemble Roma, the personification of the city depicted alongside the famous 7 hills of Rome on coins in the 1st century. The language of harlotry was regularly invoked by the biblical prophets to describe Israelites and the Judahites' infidelity to God when they worshipped other deities. Further, the woman has the name Babylon on her forehead. Babylon is a symbolic name pointing to the Babylonian Empire, a threat to ancient Israel in the 6th century BCE. The Babylonian Empire was not a political entity in the time of John, but the book of Revelation means to draw a comparison between that ancient foe and imperial Rome. Just as the ancient Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem and Solomon's temple, so too imperial Rome was responsible for the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Not only was John concerned about imperial Rome, its polytheistic practices, its persecution of Christians, and destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, but also about the potential for followers of Christ in Asia Minor to participate in polytheistic practices. The book of Revelation is especially concerned about Christians eating food sacrificed to idols. Christians would encounter meat from animals slaughtered in the name of a polytheistic deity in the marketplace, or if they were dining with a non-Christian. For the Apostle Paul, the matter necessitated nuance, as described in his correspondence with the people of Corinth. The book of Revelation is utterly uncompromising on this matter and warns against Christians who permit this, calling one such person Balaam, a non-Israelite prophet from Numbers, and another Jezebel, a devotee of Baal in 1 Kings. Familiarity with John's historical context helped make sense of the imagery and expressions used in Revelation. There is much to recommend the book of Revelation, from its rich tapestry of biblical themes and promises that God and God's followers prevail to its emphasis on worship and liturgy. Nonetheless, the book of Revelation has historically been a controversial text, especially due to a wide range of interpretations facilitated by its elusive character. Awareness of what the sacred writer intended to convey is important, lest we misread a biblical text. In this case, the literary form and conventions associated with ancient apocalyptic literature are key. Ancient apocalypses were not intended to be predictive literature, nor were the symbols to be read in wooden and literalistic ways. John's discourse is poetic, and John reiterates, often using different scenes of eschatological rewards and punishments, the same overarching theme, that only God is sovereign, that Jesus as the Christ is a unique agent of God, and that God providentially looks after God's people. The recapitulation of this message via astonishing and symbolic imagery alerts audiences of Revelation that this work is not to be received as a linear narration of events. Revelation also anticipates restoration on a cosmic scale, drawing on the language of the prophets from the Hebrew Scriptures, and with the parousia in mind, presenting Jesus as an eschatological judge and Messiah leading a millennial kingdom. The book of Revelation is potent. The book can be consoling to the oppressed and challenging to the powerful. In sum, Revelation offers a vision of justice and of hope.